Greetings, everybody. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area, from where we continue to feature the works of authors we know and love through readings, discussions, and forums, moving towards the summer season. So tonight, we're celebrating the publication of the Letters of Thom Gunn, selected and edited by August Kleinzahler, Michael Knott, and Clive Wilmer. It's published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and it is the first complete portrait of the private life, the reflections, and the relationships of a truly maverick figure in the history of British and American poetry. Thom Gunn was born in England, but lived in San Francisco for most of his life. He was the author of numerous collections of poetry. These included The Sense of Movement, Jack Straw's Castle, The Man with Night Sweats, Boss Cupid, amongst others. He also produced 2 volumes of essays in addition to his volumes of poetry. We were fortunate enough to host Thom Gunn at City Lights back in the day, and I recall a particularly tender moment between Mr. Gunn and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was attending that evening in the poetry room at City Lights. So Ferlinghetti had great respect for Mr. Gunn's work. And so we're really honored to have with us tonight this amazing crew that celebrate his work. We've got the co-editor of the Letters of Thom Gunn, August Kleinzahler. Mr. Kleinzahler is an award-winning poet in his own right. He's published numerous works and is a recipient of a National Book Critics Circle Award, the Griffin Poetry Prize, amongst others. He was a close friend of Thom Gunn's. He makes his home here in San Francisco. Joining him will be Henri Cole, the author of 10 collections of poetry and recipient of numerous awards for his work. His most recent book is Orphic Paris, a memoir published by New York Review Books. From 2010 through 2014, he served as the poetry editor of the New Republic, and he teaches at Claremont McKenna College and makes his home in Boston. And also joining us is going to be Randall Mann, the author of 5 full-length poetry collections. His first collection, Complaint in the Garden, was published by Zoo Press in 2004. It won the Kenyon Review Prize in Poetry. His second collection, Breakfast with Thom Gunn, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2009. It was a finalist for the California Book Award and the Lambda Literary Award for Gay Poetry. His most recent collection is called A Better Life, published by Persia Books. Mr. Mann makes his home here in San Francisco. Before we begin, I would like to let you know we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you can purchase copies of the letters, as well as additional titles by Thom Gunn. We'll also be featuring a Q&A with our guests at the end of the evening, so post your questions and comments in the chat function of that same Zoom dashboard. I would like to suggest that you switch to speaker view via the prompt in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen to kind of enhance your watching pleasure. Otherwise, you get that kind of weird Hollywood Squares look. So please join us now in welcoming to our virtual halls, August Kleinzahler, Henri Cole, and Randall Mann. Gentlemen, welcome to City Lights.
Hello.
Hi. Thanks, Peter.
So August, let's begin with you.
Well, I knew Thom for 20 years and we were very good friends, and I had countless lunches with him and many dinners, but I'm envious. I never enjoyed a breakfast with him.
It was a boozy breakfast.
I'm not surprised. So were the luncheons and dinners. I'd like to tell you something about the genesis of the letters and the engine and the locomotive and the chief engineer behind them, who's a young academic. I think when this all began around 2016 on his first visit to Berkeley to research a book about Thom's poetry. Michael Knott was probably 26 or 27 years old and had probably published some scholarly essays, but nothing on the order of selected letters or the biography he's finishing up at the moment. And I saw him a couple of times on that occasion, and he was extremely young and very enthusiastic. And we chatted, and he asked me about Thom and about his work. and then came back several months later and nosing around the Bancroft and Thom's archive, and came upon some letters which interested him, and very much. And then he pursued Thom's letters in other collections around the country, Texas and elsewhere. And meantime, I tried to interest Jonathan Galassi, who's running FS&G, in Thom's letters, because I had a few, because we saw each other with some frequency. We lived just about a 15-minute walk away from one another. I didn't get a lot of extended letters, although when I was teaching in the 90s, I got some wonderfully long letters. And he's a very, very good letter writer, as everyone's discovering. And but I came upon a tranche of letters with a friend of his, an academic at the University of Toronto, a gay academic, Douglas Chambers, with whom I also became friends. He was a lovely, civilized guy, and they were amazing. I mean, just chock-a-block with sexual adventures and literary insights, and great fun and extraordinarily bright. And I'd said to Jonathan Galassi, I said, you know, his letters are better than Elizabeth Bishop's. And John, I think it was, studied with Elizabeth Bishop at Harvard and revered her, was very skeptical of this and unexcited about the project. But meanwhile, Clive Wilmer, who's the co-executor of the literary estate and was a distinguished poet and scholar, translator, essayist that teaches at Cambridge, had somehow gotten a hold of Michael Knott, and they had visited Faber together. And to their surprise, Michael Hollis, the poetry editor at Faber, said that he wanted to do it. And Clive and I told Michael, neither one of us wanted to do it because it's an enormous undertaking. I mean, it takes years and years and years. And when we were old and tired, you know, and so we told Michael, we want you to do this. We want you to run with the ball. And he was delirious with excitement. He ran out and got a 6-pack of beer. You know, his ship had come in. And Clive and I, he gathered letters from, well, thousands and thousands. I think there were 10,000 letters, and winnowed them down. And there's still thousands, and Clive went through them, and I went through them, and we gave it 1, 2, or 3. Oh, you got to print this one. Well, that's a pretty printable one. No, don't worry about that. And he worked like a fiend. I mean, he quite a remarkable young man. And he got some sample letters together, and he sent them to Galassi, and he said, "Oh boy, you know, I do want to do this." So we were on, and then Wendy Lesser of the 3 Penny Review. It's a very Bay Area thing here going on. Somehow got on to Michael and was impressed by him, and she suggested to Galassi that Michael do the biography. And he'd never done anything like that. He'd written a few scholarly essays, but nothing on that order. And we had him write a sample one, and it was no damn good. It was like a scholarly article. It could have been in a quarterly, you know, the Virginia Quarterly or something. But Clive and I felt, you know, I don't think he said it to him. I said, you know, he's clearly not the man for the job. He's terrific with these. And then, you know, without us encouraging him, quite the opposite, discouraging. And this is, you wouldn't think it to know him, but it was a brazen act of chutzpah. He wrote another sample segment, and it was fabulous and lurid, and it got all of Thom and his great gift, his predatory sexual behavior, everything. And we were off to the races, and he's finishing up that biography now. So it's really on Michael Knott, who was a joy to work with. I sat down with him. I happened to be in Cork at the University of Cork visiting and giving readings, and he was finishing up a postdoc there. So a week in March several years ago, we sat down for a few hours a day and went through hundreds, if not thousands, of letters, and he got there, on time. And I regret Tom never met him, because he would really have liked them. He would have immediately tried to seduce him, but I think he would also have liked him very much. And so why don't I leave it there for the moment? We can jump back in as need be, or I can do as I'm told. Woof woof.
Randall, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. That was great, August. And, I think this is such a remarkable achievement for all of you. I got to know Michael Knott a little myself. And when I was in London in October, we took like a little Thom Gunn tour where we tried to find Thom Gunn's mother's grave. We didn't realize there was no specific plot in Golders Green Crematorium. She had been scattered on the crocus lawn. So we were looking around for a while, and, we went to his old house, and then we ended up making his meatloaf, which he was a cook. And August, you referenced he was a certain type of English cook in your great essay in Cutting One Rock. And so the recipe involved pan frying the meat before baking it in the oven, and it was a fucking disaster. It was the worst meatloaf ever. At one point, Michael and his girlfriend Carrie, we were just like looking at it like sticking to the wall. But anyway, we sort of salvaged it. So anyway, that was all that said, this is an incredible achievement. And speaking of that essay by August, I love that essay, by the way. And there's a sentence in there where you say the quality and acuity of Tom's observations would startle me from time to time, where you talk about hanging out with him. And that's really how I felt kind of going through these letters. I knew Tom a little here in person, and then around the city, I saw him waiting for a streetcar. I saw him in bars sometimes, but I mostly knew him through his poems. And, he's just the coolest poet I know. I mean, he really is, and I feel like what's so great about these letters is that, in the poems, it's like his voice is hiding in plain sight. There's that great introduction where he says, you quote from that interview, and it says, "I'm not aiming for a central voice. I want to write with the same anonymity as the Elizabethans." But, and he said that led people to have difficulty with his poetry. But I think that kind of anonymity allowed for such a universality and was really such an act of charity in the poems themselves. So it was really such a thrill to kind of dig into the kind of the sort of queer radical backstory. I kind of all I want to do is quote, but and that because this thing is so quotable, these letters are so great. I mean, they were so good. They're as good as Crane's letters. But I love that, there's a moment where he talks about moving from Filbert Street to the house that I knew on Cole Street, 1216 Cole Street. Also, when I moved here in 1998, I thought that the Cole Valley was the place where all the poets lived, because there were so many poets in Cole Valley. So he says when he moved, he says in this letter from June of 1971, he says, "You will hardly believe this, but we're about to buy the first house we looked at. It is on Cole Street, which crosses Haight, but it is about 10 blocks from Haight, and in a very cool neighborhood, mostly long hairs, big bright rooms, a studio for Bill, and a small backyard with sun in it all day. We're going to be sorry at leaving North Beach, but North Beach is going through rather bad changes and Haight is going through some pretty good ones. And though we don't have the bay right beside us, we'll have the whole of Golden Gate Park around the corner. And getting to know all different parts of that will be nice. And Cole Valley is like a row of millionaires now. So I kind of love the idea that it was a bunch of hippies. And then a bit later, he says, we're a cozy scene indeed. We're 6 plus 3 cats and 2 dogs. And the whole house becomes beautifully bigger and full of possibilities every day. Though a fellow's dreams, always about moving, do seem to continue at night with a certain persistence. So what I really love, and then that's where Thom lived throughout the rest of his life. And I sort of love kind of like the stable architecture of this home life with, you know, people, you know, the Don Duty and a rotating cast upstairs, and Thom and Mike Katay and Bill Schuessler downstairs, and the way that this seemed to enable all of his rich appetites, you know. I mean, and I love too that there's like an analogous parts in the poetry, like in Jack Straw's Castle, he says, I finally got it how I wanted it, a fine snug house when all is said and done. So, you know, it's really, it's so wonderful to read these poems, and it's like San Francisco is happening in real time. And, you know, I've been here for 24 years, and most of these letters predate when I got here, but it's such a window into not only this cool, amazing poet, but into this city. So I'll stop there, and Henri.
Thank you, Randall. Thank you, August. It occurs to me I've been asked to speak because of Cole Street and Cole Valley, that there's some sentimental connection. I only met Thom Gunn once. I appeared with him on a program, a Hart Crane evening in New York City at the 92nd Street Y. And that was the only time. I lived in New York City during the 1980s, and I guess I was in my early 30s. And I guess I was looking for a way to be a poet, you know, and there were just a few kind of gay models, it seemed to me, that I cared about. One was James Merrill, who was sort of the most kind of Apollonian model. And then there was Allen Ginsberg on the other end of the spectrum. And, you know, with his totally Dionysian poems. And it just occurred to me that Thom Gunn's work was closer to something that I wanted to try and do, which is to write poems that had aesthetic dignity, but also that were able to embrace extremes of feeling. And it was the 1980s, and I was looking for a way to write about AIDS. I wasn't sure how to do that. And then he emerged with his amazing poems, which I had the opportunity to review in The Nation in August of 1992. We had we did have a little exchange about that as well, because it came early. It came before the New York Times, and it came completely from left field. Reading the letters, I feel sort of what I feel about the poems, which is that they combined like authentic feeling with touches of humor and modesty. And those are all things I value. I guess I think empathy is the most important human emotion. And he is such an empathetic poet, but also in the letters, I never found anger. I'm sort of tired of anger. you know, and I'd never really, I'm sure he experienced anger, but I just never really, I find there's such marvelous equanimity in the poem, in the letters. And I found this very touching. I was able to get to know Oliver Sacks in the last years of his life. And one day when I visited him, maybe a year or two before he died, he was so happy to know that I admired Thom Gunn. He took me into, we were at his apartment with his partner, and he took me into a kind of a little exercise room with a wall of books and a massage table and stretching, like a therapeutic table. And he took out and he put on this therapeutic table every book by Thom Gunn on his bookshelf. You know, there were about 10 books. And he gave me this one here. He plucked out this one and gave me this one, which of course is the source of Oliver's, the title for his memoir that he published at the very end of his life. And it's inscribed, "These favorite poems by my friend Tom, now given to my poet friend Henri." So I still see him as a model of you know, kind of aesthetic dignity. We live in such a time of identity awareness, but I don't feel that is compromising in any way in his work, and that's a beautiful thing about it. There were two little episodes in the letters that I thought I might read from. Maybe I don't need to read from the Oliver Sacks part, or maybe I'll just read a few sentences from that, where he's just saying to Oliver Sacks that he has criticized Oliver's earlier work for just being cold academic writing. And when the book Awakenings comes out, he says to him, "I have also been thinking of the great diary you used to show me. I found you so talented, but so deficient in one quality, just the most important quality, call it humanity or sympathy or something like that. And frankly, I despaired of your ever becoming a good writer because I didn't see how one could be taught such a quality. The kind of deficiency I'm talking about showed up most extremely in the Dr. Kindly episode," don't know what that is, "but all over the place as well. It made for an insularity, a smallness of capacity, even when you were confronted with the whole of America as your subject. What I didn't know was the growth of sympathies as something that frequently is delayed till one's 30s. What was deficient in those writings is now the supreme organizer of awakenings, and wonderfully so. It is literally the organizer of your style." So, you know, he's wondering what happened to bring this about. And then in a later letter, he ranks him with Melville, I think, in a very touching moment. So the other little bit I thought I would read is this wonderful description. I feel there's not enough, I don't know, joy in writing. And this is a beautiful, joyful passage describing his 62nd birthday. "For my 62nd birthday, Mike cooked me a fantastic beef and carrots, tomatoes and black olives dish. Makes my mouth water just to mention it, and a zucchini soup and an antipasto of sliced avocado and mushrooms. Bob came over and cooked mashed potatoes, all he had time to do after work. Martin made a raspberry cheesecake, and best of all, Billy made strawberry shortcake at my request, but it was so rich and there was so much whipped cream that it was more like strawberry eclairs. On Labor Day, we had a picnic on Angel Island. Labor Day was September 2nd. I hadn't been there in 20 or 21 years. Last time, a large party of us had found an empty beach, stripped off all our clothes and taken acid. Michael ended up with the worst sunburn of his life that time. How times change. Just a picnic and wine drinking this time. But Angel Island is a fabulously beautiful place. And like some island in a children's adventure story, reached by a ferry. No one is allowed to live there except the rangers who look after the trees, etc. But you can camp overnight, I believe. And then he just goes on. Oh, there's just one little paragraph here. I have 9 sunflowers in the yard. They are all about 4 feet tall, except one, which is almost 9 feet tall. And this one has a face about 2 feet across. When I show it to my friends, they gasp. I am very proud of it and would like to write a poem about it, but William Blake already wrote the best sunflower poem I can imagine. So instead, I strut around feeling obscurely that it is a kind of tribute to my virility to have grown it. So.
I really consider, and everybody, I've posted links in the chat function with which you may pick up a copy of this. It's a treasure trove. It's like a treasure chest. And it's just, there's so much great material in here. And August, if I could come back to you, maybe to respond a little bit to what you've just heard, but also, talk a little bit more about, just the material itself and what it was, like, just discovering things, because just, looking through it myself, I was thinking, God, there's some really fun stuff, some great stuff in here.
Yeah, before I do that, I was amused by the letter Henri was reading about Tom's 62nd, because I remember when he turned 60 or 65, and to celebrate, he put on some very tight leather pants. He was slender and very fit and could bring it off, and shirtless and tattooed. And I was walking home, and I saw him strutting down Cole Street, headed for Haight, where he turned right and head for a bar, presumably to try to pick somebody up, and inevitably succeeding. And he looked so outrageous. I've never forgotten that. I was not the only person on the street who went, whoa. And when he was in his cruising mode, and I used to see him a number of times, he would get into a sort of a state where he was oblivious to everything around him, including me if I was nearby. He was just very focused and a bit crazed, I think, and it was great. And but going back to the letters, we began corresponding not long after I turned up in 1981, and I heard him give a wonderful talk on Basil Bunting in a little venue south of Market Street, and I admired it greatly, not least for its modesty and intelligence. And so I wrote him a note, and he invited me over, and we became good friends. And but most of the book predates our actual and epistolary friendship, and so that was very interesting to me.
One of the things that interests me is the inclusion of the letters to the 2 aunts.
Yes.
It's just such a wonderful counterpoint, you might say, to the talk about what was his name, Ambrosio or something like that, the last lover.
Yeah.
you know, that's part of what makes the book wonderful, is this combination of, well, it's sort of John Donne like, the secular with the, you know, the profane. That was brilliant to do that, I think.
Well, that was his. That was he. Um, uh, he spent a lot of time in the garden. He was very much interested in being a family guy. It was not your conventional American Leave It to Beaver family, but it was definitely a close-knit family. And he was also quite wild in his sexual and drug experiences, and he used that as nourishment for his own work, and it all comes into the work. But the other broad thing I'd like to say about the letters is, and I can tell, particularly when I look at his letters to me and other people from the time I knew him here, he takes on somewhat of the personality and the voice of the person he's writing to, and you talk about empathy. He was extraordinarily empathetic. I think that was spot on, and he has enormous range that way, and sometimes it was startling. He surprised me in many ways, many times, and you know, located when he thought I was down or being too cheeky or whatever. He's tremendously observant, and the breadth again of his empathy. All sorts of people, with his aunts, with his tricks, with his colleagues.
Another thing the letters,
large person. Yeah.
Yeah.
another thing the letters made me think about was the connection between the libido and creativity. You know, I mean, I don't know. You know, there have been moments in my life when I thought, gosh, I wish I could drink a Kool-Aid and just get rid of all the desire thing. And I remember a friend saying to me, oh, well, you would erase your creativity. You would also, you know, you would cease to be a poet. And reading the letters made me see how true that was, that there, even though he's stalled and can't write, there's some deep connection there, I feel, that is really moving and meaningful.
I agree, and I personally think libido plays a very major role for poets and their creative possibilities. And in his 70s, when it began, his libido began diminishing as his poetry began become less interesting, and he still lived very hard with as many partners as he could accommodate, and his drug taking increased significantly and dangerously. But sometimes when I'm in public and discussion comes up of Thom's work, and people say, well, are there a group of late poems that no one knows about that are lying in a drawer somewhere? And there were poems, but they weren't really publishable. And he knew it. And I think that was part of his, if he was despairing at the end, and I think maybe the drug taking was part of that. And and he had the complaints that go along with being in one's 70s. I don't think the appetite for him to continue on was very strong at that point.
Yeah. But I do love that you touch on that he's a poet of doubleness in the introduction, and I love seeing the that there were all sides to this person, as if a person can't contain all these different sides. It was, but I love coming across talking about sex and just the kind of family that you're talking about. Like there's a letter where he says, well, I have no rule against a sustained sexual relationship. It just seems that sex seems largely promiscuous since living with Mike, I get all the love I need. If that sentence makes sense. Or like to Bell Randall, short relationships can be just as full of reciprocity, after he says, no, I don't think promiscuity necessarily involves using people. So it was so wild and encouraging. I'm like, sort of cheering from my desk as he's talking about this kind of different way to think about family, which doesn't seem a contradiction at all to me. It seems to make perfect sense. And I loved how he sort of like, he lived through this truth. So that was really good. And, in terms of empathy, like one quick anecdote about Thom, like there was one time we were downtown and he was giving money to the unhoused, but he only would give money to those who looked the most challenged, or the ones who seemed least approachable, because like he said that they would have the hardest time getting help. So he would only pick out the people who sort of looked like they were having the roughest time, who were sort of the most unapproachable. So I thought that was like, it was like this small moment of humanity that I witnessed. So.
Another thing that interests me about him is that though he taught, he wasn't really an academic. He wasn't. We live in a culture now, of course, where there are no poets almost that don't teach. And so, or at least in his generation, among he's just an interesting model for how to live outside of if you don't happen to be born wealthy, how to do it. And it's an interesting model. He's exemplar to me in that sense as well. That's part of his doubleness, it seems to me, because he's in academia, but he's not really in academia. He's in California, but he's an Englishman. He writes formal verse, but he's experimenting too. That all of those things make him, I don't know, they make him international to me. It is a beautiful book, August. Thank you for allowing yourself to be seduced by this young fellow and guiding it. It's truly a remarkable. It's like a record of a whole time in poetry, which is, pre-email and gone, really.
Right. I think that's I keep returning. Dopey letters. Don't forget, I put the dog food under the behind the cabinet and so forth. But this is a remarkable human being living in a very interesting time under highly unusual circumstances, and it's you're getting a history of the 60s. You're getting a history of the AIDS epidemic. No one.
Also, you see how he sort of deals with younger people approaching him. That was interesting to me, how he negotiates come-ons from younger people. Also the discussion about formalism versus free verse, you know, where he talks about the new formalists and how empty that is. And then he uses Bishop as a model of being sort of crossing over. That was fascinating, I thought.
Yeah.
He was very unusual that way, that he could accommodate all kinds of poetry.
Yes.
There are very few, and you know, San Francisco during his year, you know, it's very cliquey. He certainly didn't fit.
Yes. But I liked it when he really liked to rank people and say, these are the people and these people are boring.
Yeah.
Even though I didn't disagree with them, I found it totally, I mean, I didn't totally agree with them. I found it fascinating to see where he positioned himself. I mean, and sometimes he changed his mind, and that was very moving too.
Yes, often.
Yeah. I mean, and the damn thing's just funny. It is funny. It is entertaining. There are so many letters where I was just like, there's so much shade. So it's so good, because that was also him in person. I like, you know, it's sort of pleasantly eviscerates lots of people, which yeah. So there are so many quotable, funny moments. I feel like, I don't know, I was laughing the whole time. So,
but I feel that people he might eviscerate, he doesn't eviscerate inconsequential people.
No.
He eviscerates people who have, you know, iron plates around them mostly. Right.
Ted Hughes, Seamus Heaney, you know, his bit on
that
Heaney
was
fascinating.
Funny. Even Auden, what he says about Auden is fascinating in comparison with Isherwood. I found that I'm dying to read his essay on Isherwood now.
Isherwood.
Yes.
He revered Isherwood as much as any contemporary.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's so interesting.
And I love too that when he found out that Auden died, in that moment in the letter, and I'll get the quote wrong, where he says something like, I loved him. It's sort of like thinking about like when Shakespeare died. I understand that he didn't like me very much. That doesn't matter. That's like hearing that Keats didn't like me, you know? So it was sort of like, it was just wonderful. I mean, I feel like there was a magnanimity and a sort of a right-headedness with a lot of the way he was thinking about kind of literature and friendships and even criticism. Like when he was writing Donald Davy, and he was like, you know, he sees criticism as an act, itself an act of friendship. I mean, I think Thom Gunn's poetry, his body of poetry, is one of the great essays in friendship.
Yes.
You know, and so I feel like these letters are really, it's sort of like a wonderful supporting body, like this sort of like silently, or sort of like it's invisible writings in the margin almost on all those poems, which is, you know, it's like, it's the hide and seek of friendship. It's so much of what Gunn is about friendship. And so that's why it was such an incredible joy to read these letters.
There's a lot of,
please, August.
There's quite a lot of joy in the letters. There's quite a lot of despair in the letters. For someone outwardly so reticent, particularly in the work, he's really quite frontal emotionally in a lot of these letters, and it's moving.
Yes, he's very direct. He's very. One letter that interested me was the one to the young fellow or younger fellow. I guess it must have been during the 80s. It's the person that the Palma Blank is based on. I couldn't find that afterwards, but he's sending him that Palma Blank, the last poem of The Man with Night Spets, and he's asking him if it's okay to publish it. You know, he's in the kind of scrupulosity of that act of inclusion is really very moving, I thought, because it's this man's life who has chosen to adopt a child and to live his life that way during a time of pandemic. And yet he couldn't, write a poem about it and publish it without conferring with him was just a very interesting gesture, I found. I mean, it's instructive, actually.
He's a very scrupulous, ethical guy, and it's all this craziness.
We forget about those things in the today mode.
Right.
You know, with Twitter and you know, we forget about those words, scrupulous and ethical.
Yeah, he would have been horrified by well, and he was not apolitical at all. He doesn't write much about it, but he had very strong feelings
Yes, yeah,
about
yeah.
Reagan and Nixon and
Yeah.
Oh, the one where he describes going, he's horrified because an abortion doctor on the street is being harassed by protesters. I think that's what it is. Am I imagining that? Isn't there a letter about that where he's and he goes out and he has words with these protesters, and then he comes back to the subject and he says, you know, I don't even like that doctor, but I was, you know, I mean, he wasn't even someone I really liked, but I felt so offended, you know, affronted that he had to address the matter publicly on the street. Was again interesting.
yeah, he was like that. He was a very odd mix of traits. Almost all of them benign and magnanimous. Again, yeah, I think of the Whitman. Well, I contain multitudes. He wouldn't have thought of himself as Whitman-esque because he wasn't. I mean, Ginsberg would, but he would have thought of himself that and did think of himself that way.
Well, I do wonder if he'd lived, even though, as you say, he wasn't writing or wasn't writing well. I do wonder what he would have written. You know, maybe he would have written essays. Maybe I miss those things that he would have written. You know,
Yes.
as a person 66 with very few models, you know, of older poets and what they're writing, I would like to have known what he would be writing.
I think essays. I think you have that right. Or he might have done translation, and he might have found a resurgence. I don't think he was one of those built for older age or extreme older age, and but he was not young when he died, and he died in bed with a sexual partner, and you know, getting loaded on heroin and cocaine and alcohol and whatnot. You know, he died like a rocker, which
Sure.
he would have loved to have had in his epitaph.
He died like a rocker, and yet he admired Isherwood, who lived, you know, who lived a long time.
Yeah, he I don't know if he was in love with Isherwood. I think at some level his admiration approached love. He just did not thought more highly of and loved being around him, and he took Mike with him down to LA, and Mike really didn't get along with both Isherwood and his partner, who his young painter partner, who sounds like he could be difficult, but
Bacardi, you mean?
yes, Don Bacardi.
Yeah. Huh. Is Mike still alive?
Very much so, and
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah.
he's what would Tom be now? He's born 29 or something like that. So what would that make him now? 90-ish?
Mm.
thereabouts. So I think Mike's
Mike's in his 90s, right?
yeah.
Born in like 21, I think.
No, it's closer in age to Tom. I think he's
Okay.
And he lives on Cole Street still?
same place
Uh-huh.
with Bob and Billy. I think it's down to them now, but they're still very much a family, and I see them on the street quite frequently. And,
He must be glad to see the letters.
I was about to say something about that. I said, "What do you think of the letters, Mike?" And he had mixed feelings. Some very passionate letters in there, and I think he might have found it a bit invasive or sad. But, I think there were some unhappy memories, when they were breaking up and realigning their relationship. But Mike was terrific with Michael Knott, who went there every day for a couple of weeks, for hours on end, and it was very forthright. And it's odd, don't you think, to be with someone for whatever 50 years and however the relationship played out, it's still your most important relationship, and then the person dies, and they have a second life as this very famous person with all these strangers
Right.
in your intimate life, and that's got to be uncomfortable.
Well, we have some questions and comments coming through in the chat. Fabian says, "Good evening, greetings from Mar del Plata, Argentina. It's 10:40 p.m. here." In what ways, in your opinion, do you think these letters illuminate or dialogue with, if at all, Gunn's poetry?
That's a good question from far away. I think one way they illuminate the poetry is many of the letters discuss his literary enthusiasms and influences. So that's one way. And in another way, as Henri was talking about, these ceaseless amorous adventures feed directly into the poetry, and it's quite evident going through it. And so it's not necessary for the reader of Gunn's poetry to know all this about him, but it's nor should it be, but it's I think it's.
I think letters are better than biographies. I mean, I look forward to reading this young man's biography, but I think letters are much more interesting. I think certainly Elizabeth Bishop's letters are way more interesting than any biography that's been written about her, and there've been so many. You enter right into someone's mind. You hear their voice, you hear the cadence of their sentences, you hear, though it gives you the field of their imagination. I mean, there's just so many reasons to read the letters. It would be fun. Sometimes I think it'd be fun to teach a class not of all these poems, but of all their books of letters, because the letters are, as an art, are really, almost extinct, becoming extinct.
Yeah. And I found it really wonderful to have you know, direct references to poems I love. So as a sort of like a fanboy,
Yes.
you know, where you see things like the direct reference to Talbot Road or their transients and residents, you know, you just have this map into, you know, in this case, the passages of joy, but, you know, you'll find, you know, it's not always a direct map. Sometimes it's running parallel, but, you know, as you're following the poems, sometimes you get these wonderful, you know, as he's saying, you know, I finally got to write about kind of like S&M and things like, you know, you have this in real time. And, you know, someone who loves the poems, or even if you don't know the poems, it's a window into the poems. It's a different way to come at them. So it's this wonderful layer, you know, and I'm with you, Henri. I mean, I think the letters, and especially when the letters are this good, it's a lot. It's much better to hear sort of like the poet's voice rather than the kind of like mediated suppositions, even if they're well informed. So
Yeah, not everyone's letters are good. I recently reviewed Creeley's letters, and he's a very good poet and you know, major American poet. And the letters were bizarrely dreary.
That's interesting.
And, you know,
Well, one of the things that's wonderful about these is that his reading life is recorded, and he has such a avid or ardent reading life, and he records all of it, and that is certainly an illuminating. It illuminates the poems, you know, to know that he loved George Herbert, for instance, to name just one thing. But they're essential reading. The letters are absolutely essential reading in terms of embracing the whole, you know, body of work of a really important world poet, in my view.
yeah.
He's such an avid reader, and he read so widely. He was, you know, he reads so much more contemporary poetry than I do. You know, I felt shamed.
his reading, you know, his enthusiasms were almost like he'd get crushes or like with certain authors. We were reading a particular author. It'll come around on the conveyor belt at one point, and we were just going through his work, a contemporary of ours, not his, and just like we're like schoolgirls talking about the cute new boy, and the just got into it. He was a great enthusiast when he cottoned on to a writer he liked. Just fused. It was like a new lover. It was it was wonderful.
And all the writers I sort of grew up on, from Merwin to James Wright to Galway Canal, you know, all of that whole pack. He says they're perfectly fine, but they're so boring, you know.
Yeah, I agree.
I just love that, actually. They're just so boring. He uses the word boring quite a bit. That to me is like the you know, I once asked him if he would write a blurb for a book, and his response was very touching. He said, maybe you know this, August, I don't know, because I figure you've read, it's one of those 10,000 communications that you've read. But he said, you know, I was so grateful for that review you wrote, that if I said anything positive about you, people would think that's why I was saying it, you know, and that I don't want that to be the case.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's such a good example of his scrupulosity, that is very touching.
Yes. Yeah, he was oddly uncommonly scrupulous that way. He once said he was enthusiastic about my work, and from the time I met him, and he said at one point, I would recommend you to Farrar, Straus and Giroux, but it wouldn't do any good. They don't pay any attention to anything I suggest.
Huh.
So I won't.
That's funny. Yeah.
But he was very, very pleased when they took me on independently of his.
There's a very lovely letter where he's talking about your work, August, and he says that he thought you would go into this, kind of automatic middle-aged state or something, but no, you didn't. You just went, you kept growing, and you became, a kind of a more magnificent poet, and that's a beautiful, beautiful passage.
I didn't want to bore him. I couldn't bear found boring by Thom. That would have been I don't know that I would have recovered from that. So I tried extra hard to make it the big push to move forward.
Well, we have essentially run out of time, but I mean, this has been such a delight just to have you all share your enthusiasm for Thom and in such a lovely way. So I'm so happy that we could bring the three of you together, August, Henri, Randall, and also really a big shout out to Jonathan Mullen of FSG in the chat. He just dropped off a little comment and thanking him for all that he does. And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us tonight. Just a delight through and through. So I posted links in the chat with which you may purchase this fabulous tome. As I said before, it's a treasure chest, and I think you'll really, really enjoy what's in it. Also want to remind you all, City Lights is open for business. We're open 7 days a week from 12 noon until 8 p.m. So please come on down, browse our stacks. We have a full selection of Thom's books, and Henri and Randall and August. So check out the Poetry Room. It's one of the biggest poetry selections in the country. We'd love to see you. And tonight's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, a publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So take care, everyone. We hope to see you all again soon.
Been a pleasure, and I think Thom would have been a bit embarrassed, but quite pleased with what we had to say about it.
Thank you both for the work you're doing. Thank you. Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, thank you. It was such an honor. Thank you so much.